Hey guys, it's Shadow. Today I'm going to be ranking all 29 AoE2DE campaigns. This is at least partially inspired by an Ornlu video series. He hasn't finished it yet, but it's a really interesting watch and I give it a really big recommend. I'll be linking it in the description below. This won't be nearly as detailed as his video series is on the topic though. I also will be rating the historical battles in a separate video coming later, so stay tuned for that. First of all, we have the Alaric campaign. For me, the Alaric campaign has a couple of, I'd say, a little bit grindy missions. Not as bad as some of the other campaigns that we'll be showing later on, though. The Alaric campaign has at least a couple of ones I found really fun. Raising Hellas, for example, was a really fun mission. And it's relatively inoffensive, I think is the best way of putting it. For me, it's probably going to go in the A tier. Probably lower A tier, though, closer to the B tier. Next up, we have the Art of War campaign. Now, obviously, this isn't really a standard campaign. It's more just to try and get new players into multiplayer. But in that kind of respect, I did at least enjoy it, and it was one of the main things that got myself into multiplayer. It's going to be a C tier campaign for me. But I do have a special appreciation for it beyond that. Next up, we have the Barbarossa campaign. Now, in the original version of this video, I was going to be doing a top 5 or top 10 campaigns on AoE2. Barbarossa is number 6 on that list. It has a special place in my heart. I really enjoy the campaign, especially like mission 1 where it's almost like role-playing where you're trying to get all the relics to then make all the other city-states recognize you as the leader. I also really enjoyed Emperor in a Barrel as well. Those are definitely the two highlights of this campaign for me. But the biggest thing for me was the mission where you actually convert your opponent's villages to make your own base. I thought that was such a cool concept, and I don't really remember seeing it in any other campaign to date. I think the only one that can compare that to was the Voices of Babylon campaign AoE1. That's definitely going to be an easy A tier for me. Next up, we have Barry, and this is a couple of missions that I enjoyed that other people may not have enjoyed. It also is one of the more grind-fest campaigns, so I'll call it. Mission 4 especially, the Best Laid Plans, it was one of those missions that I had to retry, I think it was like 10 or 15 times. And it was a very, very difficult mission for me at the time, because I wasn't very good at the game. But at the same time, it didn't feel like a grind to me, so I was just learning how all the triggers worked, how all the different alliances worked, how to best get your economy set up and whatnot. So I actually really enjoyed this mission in spite of its difficulty. For me, it's going to have a C tier overall though, just because of how grindy a lot of the other missions are, especially number 5, where you can essentially, I remember doing this to myself a couple times whilst I was playing through it, you can essentially soft lock yourself into being unable to complete it due to the way the buildings spawn and the units spawn. Next up, we have the El Cid campaign. This is one of the ones that was introduced in the Age of Conquerors. I've always enjoyed this campaign. It's obviously not very historically accurate, and it's not particularly, I can't think of the word for it. It's not particularly exciting, put it this way. Most of the missions are very standard. You just want to essentially defeat the enemy by destroying X number of buildings. And it's very thematic like that way in all of the missions. But at the same time, it's enjoyable enough and it's relatively standard. So it's going to be a B tier campaign for me. Next up, we have the Grand Dukes campaign. I actually really enjoyed the campaigns that came out with the Lords of the West expansion. For me, the Grand Dukes wasn't quite as good as Horde of Ills, but it was still really good. The storytelling was a little bit off, I found, compared to all of the other campaigns. I think part of that might have just been the writing. I was trying to relate a little bit too much to Joan of Arc when it was realistically a separate story. Beyond that, though, the actual gameplay in these missions for me was quite enjoyable. None of them felt super grindy. I know a couple of the later missions were a little bit more on the grindy end, but they weren't too bad for me. And I really, really enjoyed all of the missions beyond that, especially Mission 1. Mission 1 got you straight into the battle, straight into the root of the story. And for me, it's gonna be in the lower part of the S tier. Speaking of the Lords of the West campaigns, the Horde of Ills is actually one of my favorite campaigns. I love the role-playing aspect of it because you get to have these heroes that then level up. You have a lot of these missions rely on your hero units becoming stronger. I wouldn't say rely, but they definitely improve with your hero units getting stronger. I think the only mission which I didn't enjoy as much was mission 2, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, it was called Bohemond and the Emperor. And the reason I didn't enjoy it so much is because of the grindy aspect of trying to kill off some buildings to then weaken the Cataphract army, which was invincible otherwise. So I wasn't a huge fan of that aspect, but the rest of the campaign I really, really enjoyed. Definitely going in the S tier for me as well. Next up, we have one of the classic campaigns, the William Wallace campaign. Now, in terms of nostalgia, this would be an S, but in terms of actually having a fun campaign, obviously for me, this is probably going to be more on the C tier. The storytelling behind it is obviously not very historically accurate, but it's just kind of there to get you into the game, teach you some of the basics. I still to this day actually enjoyed the Battle of Falkirk, but the rest of the campaign is obviously very, very easy. It's designed to be easy, and it's therefore not as exciting. Okay, full disclaimer, I hate the Blood Dracula campaign. Easy E tier for me. I very much disliked Mission 1. Mission 2 wasn't a big fan of either. Mission 3 was just an absolute slog grind fest, was not a fan of that one. And Mission 4 and 5 for me were just kind of boring. For me, if I was rating this out of 10, it'd be a 1 out of 10. I'm really sorry to any Blood Dracula fans we have. But for me, it was also weird that you played as so many different factions. It wasn't very coherent, I think is the best way of putting it. Next up, we have the Bayon campaign. At the risk of butchering the name of that any more times, I'm going to call it the Burmese campaign. I definitely enjoyed a couple of the missions here, especially mission 2, where you have to capture the relics and... Oh, sorry, I think you have to actually keep the relics in your monasteries and avoid them getting raised. And you need to generate a certain amount of gold. I found that one really interesting. I quite like those kind of missions. Definitely not the craziest craziest campaign by any stretch of the imagination. And mission 6, I still to this day remember it being an absolute grind fest. It's gonna be either lower B tier or a high C tier. For the moment, I'm gonna put it in lower B tier. Just because I can think of more missions in Bayon that I enjoyed than in the Barry campaign. Next up, we have the Guardian Martyr campaign. Now, it's really unfortunate for me that this has one of my all-time favorite missions in it, and yet the rest of the campaign for me was just so unenjoyable. Most of the missions are quite grindy, especially in terms of getting, like mission 1, if I'm not mistaken, you have to capture towers, which then give you 5 population space, which means that your opponent then has 5 less population space to play around with, and you have 5 more. And then it's just a back and forth until you can eventually get a bigger mass of units. The one I really liked though was the colonization mission. Unfortunately, when I played it through on DE, it did have a couple of bugs, but I still to this day remember this mission being really enjoyable on HD, and even more so on DE for me. The overall campaign gets a D, but that specific mission, I can't remember the name of it right now. I think it's mission 3. That one gets an easy S tier for me. Next up, we have the Genghis Khan campaign. For me, the Genghis Khan campaign is a bit of a strange one. I like most of the missions, but I have problems with a couple of them. For example, mission 1 I've never enjoyed, although it does set a very good tone for the rest of the campaign. Mission 3 can be a bit of a grind fest at times, although I like the concept behind it. And mission 6, I really love the concept behind the campaign mission, where it's like a one-on-one battle. You're going to try and siege your opponent. It just ends up being a bit too on the easy side at the end of it. In spite of saying that, though, the overall experience of the campaign is really enjoyable for me, and it's going to be a solid B tier. And next up, we have the Attila the Hun campaign. Full disclaimer, this is my favorite campaign in AoE2, possibly of any RTS, honestly. It feels very true to the Huns. Mission 1, you're destroying your enemies. Mission 2, you're very much destroying your enemies. And the rest of the campaign kind of has that feel to it. I believe it's Mission 5 where the Western Roman Empire sends a horde of enemies at you, and you're clinging on for dear life and then trying to fight them back again. Mission 6, the Catalonian Fields, you have to destroy the wonders before they're built. I find this incredible, and it's definitely one of my favorite campaigns. Easily my favorite in AoE2. Next up, we have the Ivalio campaign. I'm probably going to butcher the name a few times. I really like this campaign. I think it's solid. It has a couple of missions I have a couple of gripes with. So mission 1 was quite boring to me. But I really enjoyed a couple of the other ones which were a little bit strange, I'm going to say. Like, for example, the one with the Bogger Mills. You're able to try and get all these little regions converted. I really liked that one. I also really enjoyed the one we have to try and convince the enemy chieftains to join you to then fight the Golden Horde. I thought that was really cool. For me, it's going to be an A tier campaign, possibly slightly ahead of Alaric. Next up, we have one of the classics, the Joan of Arc campaign. I would be a monster to put this any lower than the B tier, which is where it's going to be going. It's a lot of the missions are pretty easy, except for mission 6. Mission 6, even when I recently recompleted it, was still a little bit tricky. Definitely not as hard as I found it back when I first tried playing on DE, but still one of the hardest missions in AoE2 for me personally. Otherwise, though, it's a relatively inoffensive campaign. It's relatively enjoyable. It's the only major gripe I have with it is mission 5. Fuck mission 5. Honestly, I hated mission 5. One of the worst designs ever. Is the problem for me is I think it's the AoE2DE AI having too much ability to micro on harder AIs, because the cannon galleons, when you're trying to get past them and you're trying to kill them with your bombard cannons, they just constantly micro around and you're trying to kill them. And then the villager spawns can be a little bit risky as well. For example, if you lose some of the ones on the far left-hand side of Paris, you then have to restart the mission, and it's always a bit of a grind to restart the mission. So, otherwise, Joan of Arc is a very good campaign. That mission, not my favorite. Next up, we have the Kotian Can campaign, and I really enjoyed it. I think the last Khan's campaigns are actually really underrated here. A lot of the missions felt very true to what I'd imagine being the humans was there, at either trying to help a certain group or sack and pillage a certain group, defending against the Tatars, deciding whether you want to help the Bulgarians or the Hungarians at the end of it after you've been betrayed. For me, it's going to be in the S tier, just ahead of the Grand Dukes campaign. The Loi is one of those campaigns I enjoy watching others play. I do not enjoy playing it myself, and that's because it's just a complete grind fest. Other people do it in some, they have some interesting approaches to the missions, which is why I've enjoyed watching other people do it. But for me, I did not enjoy playing through any of the missions that I can recall, because every single one of them, your opponents have better and more units than you, and consistently. And you're being chased around the entire map with massive groups of units, or you're defending completely useless allies, as is the case in Mission 1. Next up, we have the Edward Longshanks campaign. This is also one of the ones that was recently released in the Lords of the West expansion. I think for me, it was just a bit too easy. There wasn't really any major difficulty spike throughout the campaign. I think that's probably why I didn't enjoy it as much. I have a weird, I don't know, I'm gonna put it in this C tier behind Barry. I really enjoyed having Wolf at the end of it, and some of the storytelling was quite interesting. The actual gameplay was just a little bit bland, in my opinion. And next up, we have the Montezuma campaign. I really like this campaign. As a kid, I hated this campaign. I thought it was terrible. But when I actually went and replayed it on D, I actually had a lot of fun, honestly. Mission 1 didn't feel as grindy as I did when I was a kid. Mission 2 wasn't too bad. I believe Mission 3, is that the one where you have Tabasco as an ally and you basically can't save them on hard difficulty from what I tried. But that one I find a little bit grindy, but still enjoyable. And a lot of the other ones beyond that had the same kind of feel to it. And the final mission, even though it's a bit on the easier end, I've always loved that one as well. And one of the missions, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's mission 4 or 5. I did a bit of a speed run of it, and I've always liked doing the speed run because otherwise the mission is rather boring. This will go just above the Burmese campaign. Now, the Patakudi campaign was there to replace. I can't remember what the name of it was now. It was replacing one of the campaigns from AoE2 HD. Unfortunately, I find it so boring. Like, all the missions are very grindy. It's complete Inca mirror in almost every mission, which for some people might be enjoyable. For me, this did not help the campaign at all. It's just gonna be an easy E tier for me. Like, it's slightly more enjoyable than the Vlad Dracula campaign because I found a couple of missions at least had redeeming qualities about them, but I didn't enjoy them overall. Next up, we have the Prithviraj campaign. I actually really enjoyed this one, especially Mission 4. Mission 4, where you're getting attacked by this massive horde of cavalry units, so you gotta try and defend with like a somewhat of a deathmatch start. I found that one incredible. The Digvijaya I also quite enjoyed as well, where you're in a defensive position, you gotta defend against lots of enemies. But it's not grindy to the same level that Liloi or one we'll talk about soon, the Tariq Ivan Zayad campaign were. For me, it's gonna go just below Barbarossa. The Saladin campaign is one of those classic AOK campaigns, and every time I play it, I've got to try and get rid of almost the nostalgia to try and evaluate it fairly. Because again, on nostalgia alone with William Wallace as well, this would probably be in the S tier. A couple of the missions when I replayed them weren't as enjoyable as I remember them being, especially the one where with the Crusaders are attacking our trade routes. I really didn't like that mission. I think it's the second mission. But the mission 1, for a fixed forces scenario, I've always actually kind of enjoyed this one because it more tells a story as opposed to making any kind of difficult gameplay. And mission 6, where you're defending the Wonder at all costs, I thought it was pretty cool. I played it through on standard difficulty later to defeat all the enemies. Obviously, some people can do defeating all the enemies on hard as well. I'm not brave enough to attempt that myself. But that'll probably be just for I'm gonna say just ahead of the Joan of Arc campaign. Next up we have the Sforza campaign, or the Italian campaign, as I'll say to make it a little bit easier. It's relatively inoffensive, I think is the best way of putting it. If I remember correctly, on HD, the campaign was quite significantly different, or at least a couple of the missions were quite different. And I really didn't enjoy them on HD, whereas I think that the team really improved them for DE. Probably just above the Burmese campaign. Maybe even slightly ahead of Montezuma, actually. Next up, we have the Sunjata campaign. This one was a bit of a mess to me. It was like most of the time you're against other Malian, like it was like a Malian mirror, or you were against Ethiopians occasionally as well. Most of the missions were quite boring. I think that I can't remember if this was I think Yodip was the Stele one. Sunjata doesn't really have anything that I can remember being that overly exciting about it. I definitely didn't have any highlights that stick in my brain. And Mission 5 was a massive grind as well. I do remember that much. It's either upper E tier or lower D tier for me. I think I'm going to put it in upper D tier for the moment. Speaking of grindy campaigns, now we have the Suryavaman campaign. Now, in spite of it having some grindy tendencies, the actual campaign itself I didn't find too boring. It has a couple of weird mechanics, which I actually went back into the campaign missions for this one just to remind myself what it was about. And I think it was mission 3 where you had to convert or kill one of the enemies inside the base, and then go on and send an envoy down to your starting base and whatnot. Couple of those things were a little bit strange to me, but otherwise I did enjoy it for what it was. It's gonna go just above Barry in the C tier. Next up, we have the Tamerlane campaign. Speaking of ones that I really enjoyed, this is definitely up there. This is probably my second favorite campaign when I think about it. It feels very thematic to the Tatars in this time period. Uh, Going around and destroying lots of places, and then having the backstabs and trying to defend against them. All of the missions feel quite dynamic to me, and in terms of a role-playing element, it really does have that as well. Next up, we have another one of my least favorite campaigns, the Tariq Ivan Zaid campaign. Now, it's slightly above Sunjata, but not much. Basically, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3 of the missions are a complete grind fest. One of them is a fixed forces scenario, which I did not enjoy too much because it's the one where your units take damage on the mountain. So basically, the way to complete it is to use one unit to level all their units down the mountain, kill all those units, and then work your way back through the mountain. And I just did not find that particularly enjoyable either. I think mission 1 is somewhat enjoyable from memory, but it can still be a little bit on that grindy pathway. But for me, at least, it did have a bit of a highlight, whereas Sanjata, it didn't even feel satisfying to complete. Next up, we have the Francisco de Almeida campaign. This has one of my favorite missions in the game. So it's the one where you get resources for destroying buildings. I think it's mission 4. That for me was one of the easiest highlights of any mission, any campaign. An easy S tier scenario. The rest of the campaign is a little bit bland and boring, I'm gonna say. But really big kudos to whoever actually made that particular mission. For me, it's gonna be just above Suryavarman and below the Burmese campaign. And last but not least, we have AoE2DE. AoE2DE was, for me, it's similar to Sujata in some ways, where it was kind of boring. But I at least liked some of the mechanics they had in it, where they had the broken stelae mechanic, where you got resources for capturing the individual villages. And that was at least interesting to me. Beyond that, there wasn't much to it that I particularly enjoyed. It's gonna go below the Art of War campaign. Well, there we have it. That is my ratings for every single AoE2DE campaigns. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I'll hopefully see you in the next video.